On the 31st of July 1948, a courtroom in Nuremberg sentenced Alfried Krupp to 12 years in prison and stripped him of every share, every factory, and every mark of his family's steel empire. Judges called his firm the backbone of Hitler's war machine, run on the forced labour of tens of thousands of prisoners. 3 years later, the sentence was gone. The fortune was back in his hands. Alfried Krupp walked out and became, once again, one of the richest men in Europe. The company that failed him had a name older than Germany itself. It traced back to Alfried Krupp, a 19th century steelmaker known across Europe as the Cannon King, the man whose steel guns armed the Prussian army and helped win the wars that unified the German nation. By the 20th century, control had passed down the family line to Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, and then to his son, Alfried. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, the Krupp works in the city of Essen became the centre of German rearmament. The firm's factories turned out tanks, artillery pieces, and submarines for the German Navy. Inside the company, the operation was known as the Arsenal of the Reich. This was not the family's first arsenal. In the First World War, Krupp built the giant siege howitzer nicknamed Big Bertha, after Bertha Krupp, the heiress who controlled the firm at the time, and used it to smash Belgian forts in the war's opening weeks. In the war's final year, Krupp engineers built a separate weapon, a long-range gun that shelled the French capital of Paris itself from more than 70 miles away. When Germany lost that war, the Treaty of Versailles ordered Krupp to stop making weapons entirely. The company got around the ban quietly, developing submarine designs through a front company in the Netherlands and artillery designs through a Swedish partner company, keeping German weapons engineering alive through the 1920s while the rest of the world looked away. By the time Hitler needed tanks and guns in the 1930s, Krupp had never really stopped making them. Building that arsenal took workers, and Germany was running out of them. Krupp solved the problem the way much of German industry did during the war. The company forced roughly 100,000 people into its factories and mines. Records entered at trial later broke the number down. 69,898 were foreign civilians, dragged from occupied countries and put to work under guard. 23,076 were prisoners of war. Nearly 5,000 were concentration camp prisoners, shipped in and worked alongside the others in the forges and coal pits of Essen. In the summer of 1944, Krupp officials personally selected 520 Jewish women from a camp that answered to Buchenwald and put them to work at a company plant. Conditions in the camps built to house these workers were overcrowded and food was scarce. Long-time Krupp employees served as foremen over the forced labourers, and beatings were common. When the war ended, American occupation authorities decided the men who ran Krupp would answer for it. The Krupp Trial opened in December of 1947, the 10th of 12 major war crimes trials held by the United States in occupied Germany. 12 Krupp directors sat as defendants, Alfried among them. The charges centred on plunder of occupied territory and the use of forced labour. The court cleared Alfried Krupp of preparing a war of aggression, but on the labour and plunder charges, it found him guilty. On the last day of July 1948, the judges handed down 12 years in prison and ordered every asset he owned sold off. For a family that had run the same company for 4 generations, it looked like the end. Alfried Krupp was not the only man in the dock. Of the 12 Krupp directors charged alongside him, 11 were convicted, with sentences ranging from 2 years up to Alfried's 12. Only one defendant, a man named Karl Feich, was acquitted outright. The Krupp trial was one of 12 so-called subsequent proceedings held at Nuremberg after the main tribunal against Hermann Göring and the rest of the top Nazi leadership had already closed, part of a broader American effort to hold German industry itself to account for what it built and who it worked to exhaustion building it. For a moment, the Krupp verdict stood as proof that a boardroom, and not just a uniform, could be judged guilty of the war. It was not. In January of 1951, the American High Commissioner for Occupied Germany, John J. McCloy, announced that Alfried Krupp and 8 of the directors convicted alongside him would be released. The property order was reversed as well. Assets valued at around $45 million, along with the company itself, were handed back to him in full. Krupp had served roughly 3 years of a 12-year sentence. The decision set off an outcry that reached the highest levels of American politics. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote directly to McCloy, asking why the United States was freeing so many convicted Nazis. Rumors spread that Krupp's American lawyer had paid McCloy off, claims McCloy denied flatly for the rest of his life, calling the decision a matter of conscience rather than politics. Whatever the reasoning, the outcome was plain. A man convicted of plundering occupied Europe and working prisoners in his factories was, within a few years, running one of the largest industrial companies on the planet again. He did not simply recover, he surged. Within a few years of walking free, Krupp's company ranked among the 12 largest corporations in the world. By the early 1960s, Alfried Krupp's personal fortune was estimated at more than $1 billion, making him, by most counts, the richest man in Europe. The same works that had run on forced labour less than 2 decades earlier were now producing steel, ships, and industrial machinery for a rebuilt continent, under the same family name that had supplied the Kaiser's cannons and Hitler's tanks alike. The workers Krupp had once forced into its factories saw almost none of that recovered fortune. In December of 1959, facing pressure and bad publicity, Krupp agreed to pay a group representing former Jewish forced labourers up to 10 million German marks, worth a little over $2 million at the time, split among close to 2,000 survivors, and criticised at the time as far too small for what had been done to them. Broader compensation for Nazi-era forced labour across German industry did not arrive until the very end of the 20th century, when German companies, including Krupp's corporate descendant, joined a national fund to pay survivors more than 50 years after the labour itself. Alfried Krupp never stood trial again. He spent the rest of his life as one of Europe's wealthiest industrialists instead. Alfried Krupp died in Essen in July of 1967. He left no simple inheritance. His son had already given up any claim to the family fortune, so Alfried placed the entire company into a charitable foundation bearing his name, the Alfried Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach Foundation, which began its work at the start of 1968. For the first time since the 1800s, no Krupp stood at the head of the Krupp company. 3 decades later, in March of 1999, the firm merged with its old rival Thyssen to form ThyssenKrupp, folding the Krupp name into a new corporate identity built from 2 of Germany's oldest steel dynasties. The company that grew out of that merger still builds warships. A division known today as ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems, based in the port city of Kiel, has delivered nearly 280 submarines and surface vessels to 27 navies around the world since 1960, employing roughly 9,000 people. Its current flagship design, a stealth submarine built with a hull that resists magnetic detection, is being built for German and Norwegian crews under the NATO flag, the same alliance formed to stand against the kind of aggression the original Krupp arsenal once fed. Customers today include democratic navies across Europe and beyond, buying hulls from the direct corporate descendant of the firm. A Nuremberg court once ordered stripped to nothing the forges that armed the Reich with slave labour, now build the ships that patrol under the flags of the nations that once tried Alfried Krupp for what those forges did. That is the arithmetic of the Krupp story. 12 years handed down, 3 years served, a fortune seized on paper, and a fortune waiting untouched behind it. An arsenal condemned in a Nuremberg courtroom, and an arsenal still standing under a different name, still building for navies nearly 80 years later. The verdict was real. So was the reversal. Both belonged to the same company on the same stretch of the Ruhr, and neither one erased the other. Thanks for watching. If you like this, you will also enjoy our look at what happened to Germany's abandoned tanks after the war. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories of the war's unfinished ending.